which is why do we think it's possible to overcome humanness? Why is that desirable? Where does that originate in? Right? And so hold that thought. Let's talk about witches. Witch, though most of you probably have a weird idea of witches sort of created by and this parallels in the classical world the idea of the sophist. Sophist was a wise person, a teacher. And so the witch and the sophist are two characters in the classical world who are recognized as being wise for different reasons. And the sophist is going to find itself in tension with the philosopher in the guise of Socrates, the lover of wisdom, right? The person who pursues wisdom for the sake of wisdom, right? And not for the sake of its use value, which I think is sort of what science does. So if we're going to ask, are witches monsters? Probably we can say the Wicked Witch in all the manifestations is recognizable as a monster, right? The hunchback, large nose, green, pasty skin, warty sort of witch. And this is paralleled, I think, in culture in Shakespeare in the three witches in Macbeth. The three witches in Shakespeare's Macbeth are supposed to map onto the fates, and so we're not supposed to interpret them in this classical monstrous sense, even though if you read the witches' chant, it's all about the use of nature and the incorporation of nature to sort of create the conditions of a disruption of the harmonious relationship in nature, breaking it apart, recombining it. You get the same sense of science in the witches' chant that you get in the mad scientist, except the witch is more connected to nature, the scientist disconnected. So this raises questions, and I think actual questions of witchcraft versus science craft and the ability to produce knowledge. And this, I think, if we take seriously science as a potential way to know, but a problematic way of knowing, right? One that leads to madness, potentially, then witchcraft leads to enchantment. And enchantment, I think, if you go back to the Theaetetus, Socrates says to Theaetetus, all philosophy begins in wonder. That the human condition is one where we are meant to be curious and pursue wisdom, but not for the sake of what it can do to allow us to dominate or become powerful or contort our being so that we can impose our will on the world. And so I think enchantment actually represents the counterbalance to science. And historically, we know that the attempts to root out witchcraft were undertaken primarily by social institutions that shared in power and dominance of the human condition, the church and certain governments, where there was an attempt to control what could be known. Right? So witchcraft is not about sort of one body of knowledge, it's about a way of being. It's a practice of being not just in the world, but harmoniously situated in the world. And so this, I think, is what existentialism is supposed to do, right? Help us belong to the world in a harmonious way. So this leads to a number of ideas. One is place-based resistance. Place-based resistance is the critical power of reason applied to environmental problems that is only a possible solution that is derivative of the context of connectivity that is bolstered by scientific underpinnings rather than led by scientific discovery. So place-based resistance is the idea that you are really connected to where you live. We don't live this way anymore. Right? We are in sort of a perpetual state of diaspora. Most of you came to this institution to get an education with expectations that once you graduate, you'll leave. But you don't intend to leave and go back to where you came from. You want to leave and go somewhere else. And this transitory sort of way of being is perpetual disconnection. You never feel embedded in a place. We're always looking for the next best thing, but the next best thing is always right outside our grasp. And so there's this, I think, if you take your place in the world seriously, that leads to a different way of knowing. So a social epistemology rather than a scientific epistemology. And I think this is reflected in the rise of care ethics, which we can talk about in Q&A if you have questions. But care ethics, originating from a feminist perspective of how morality should work, deprioritizes reason and prioritizes affection and care and understanding, emotional understanding, things that reason can't actually do. Reason is cold and distant and calculating. And so care ethics offers this sort of counterbalance to a way of being. All right, so I'm going to sort of tie this up with some more clear thoughts, and then we'll do some Q&A and see what you think. If the primary question of our investigation of environmentalism of the future was what does it mean to be an environmentalist in and of the future, then the answer is surely we must begin to conceive of ourselves not as embedded in the environment, but as the environment. We are both constituted by and constitutive of the natural world because we are the natural world. And you go all the way back to Rumi in the 13th century, the Persian poet Rumi, who's going to say that we're all stardust, right? There's this idea exists a long time ago in the sort of constitution of human being. And I think that bringing that back actually allows us to be in the world in a better way. So usually we approach this question as being a part of rather than being apart from. If you've been to any of these lectures, you've heard me use this trope over and over and over, right? But I think this only shuffles our feet on the issue of understanding ourselves as constituted by nature, where we must rather interpret our being as an integrated whole. If the natural world is not but resources and, as Marx intones, collective ownership of means of production, the way to liberation and a better society, if that's our goal, then we must realize that humanity, and not just human labor, is a resource that has to be collectively owned. This is the full subversion of the individual, where the problems of my neighbor are legitimately my own, and suddenly we find ourselves concerned about the content of the concept of neighbor more than the reality that I am responsible for all beings and not just my own. It's not a question of who is my neighbor, but a reconciliation of the individual self with the understanding that all of creation is my neighbor. All being is that for which I am ultimately responsible. Hegel's project is one that is still bound by the Cartesian impulse to privilege mind over matter. The result of this undercurrent of Hegelian thought is that it not only permeates subsequent thinkers' ideas, but it sends them hurtling into the future on a trajectory that can only miss the mark, where we understand the mark to ultimately be inhabiting a better society, coupled with a deeper understanding of human being. We see this in Marx, where his focus is on the need to liberate the worker through the control of the material means of production, placing high value on the human in the matrix of social being, while completely ignoring the natural world and its many inhabitants. Further, the problem inherent in Hegel's project manifests in Nietzsche's work, embodied in the concept of the Übermensch, where resentment is not just the motivation for overthrowing the slavish organization of society, but it is an overthrowing that is defined by the Dionysian rejection of epistemic order. Further, the Hegelian project falters in the hands of Heidegger, whose concepts of thrownness and Dasein, literally being here, are carefully constructed attempts to account for the disjointedness of being in the world half-formed. What do I mean by half-formed? For most philosophers since Descartes, and especially those that are caught in the thrall of Hegelian dialectics, the material world is a negation of the abstraction contained in the idea, God, right? The natural world is logic made concrete, but it is ultimately stuff, and of consequence only for the ability of the self as self-aware self-consciousness to achieve full self-awareness. That is, the world exists as an absolute other, which provides the necessary negation of the I for an I as mind to form a concept of the self. This is where existentialism locates the nexus of our inability to understand ourselves. Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, broadly understood in his philosophical project, is a process of realization whereby nature represents absolute otherness, which allows us to comprehend the greater philosophical truth, which is the totality of infinite being, again, God. But it is the dialectic of nature as a component part that captures most succinctly where the problem of modern environmental ethics lies in contemporary culture. Hegel argues that the dialectic of nature begins in art and religion, where the two, as thesis and antithesis, synthesize into philosophical knowledge about existence. In art, we begin with representational art of natural objects and proceed dialectically to the representational presentations of human form in classical art. This is realism. From these two dialectical components, according to Hegel, we achieve synthesis in Romanticism, which was the highest form of art when Hegel was writing. On the religion side of the dialectic, we begin with nature worship and proceed to religion mediated by law, or revealed religion, Judaism, right, in the classical monotheistic sense. This synthesizes into what Hegel claims is Protestant Christianity, again, the highest form of religion, or the best form of religion when Hegel was working, as a way of embodying the difference of God as an abstract thing into a human and recognizable counterpart, Jesus. But what if Hegel is off the mark with his postulation about how nature and the absolute other are brought back into the being of total understanding? We are always engaged in a process of self-negation, not the typical negation that provides the necessary aspects for being to be, right, to act as existence, but a deeper misunderstanding of the self, which does not integrate the natural world into the being of being. That is, existence as a way of existing. Existing as belonging to. The madness of science is the ongoing attempt to subvert ways of being that are different than that of the Western imperial understanding of existence as that which we are meant to control. Science can be a tool for deepening our understanding of nature, but we should not confuse it with the only way or the best way to be in the world. The mad scientist is not a corruption of the scientist archetype, but the logical outcome of a Western concept of being. The which, by contrast, is located in place, is tethered intimately to a way of being in a place that generates a deep connection to that place, but is not about control, is rather about coexistence in a larger matrix of beings. As such, deep ecology and dark ecology are two sides of the same coin, where the coin is a social awareness of nature imbued with a recognition of overcoming that erases the subjective self and carries over into the philosophical understanding that develops out of Hegel's master-slave dialectic. The entailment of this is a rejection of the apocalyptic as the pure negation of a socialist nature, embracing instead an environmental ethic that develops philosophical truth as an apprehension of ethical life, as it is constituted in nature, not merely as a part of nature, but as properly belonging to nature. That is, nature is ordered logically, and we are a part of that logical order. Science, in the West, the way that we live science, is an attempt to break free of the logical constraints of being.